Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the 11th in the series of United Way's Realities of Inequity sessions, which really focus on the obstacles that people face to achieving economic stability and what can be done to really break down these barriers. And so these sessions are based on the findings of United Way's ALICE report, which reveals exactly why so many Marylanders can't get ahead. And let me begin by defining ALICE for you. ALICE stands for those who are asset limited, they're income constrained, but they are employed. Hardworking people who just can't make ends meet. So these are people working in 1, 2, sometimes more typically low-paying jobs like cashiers and clerks, healthcare aides, grocery store workers, delivery service employees, childcare staff, and the like. And so it's very, very important for us to understand the makeup of ALICE. They are essential to ensuring that we can navigate our lives with ease, but they can't afford the essentials because the cost of living really just far outpaces what they earn every single day. So our last ALICE report, released in 2020, it showed that a staggering 39% of Maryland households are at or below the ALICE earnings threshold. And so that number is, without a shadow of a doubt, much higher since the pandemic. I think we all can understand that. So to put this in perspective, a family of 4, they need to earn $87,000 a year. That is correct. It's not a misprint. $87,000 a year just to cover the very basics, including housing, food, healthcare, transportation, and yes, childcare. And so here's a quick breakdown of what we call the ALICE survival budget, with food being the 3rd highest expense. And recent inflation is causing families to spend on average an additional $300 or more each month on food alone, right? And so at United Way, we continually examine call reports from our 211 helpline and other data sources to just sort of gauge needs in our community. And food is always among the top requests. Look at that, nearly 20,000 calls last year from folks who were hungry, looking for help so they can feed themselves and their families, right? And so we chose today to have today's discussion because this week is, some of you may know, National Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week. But we know that these are year-round issues for so many in our region. So we provide food where it's needed, when it's needed, and sometimes we do that in places you wouldn't expect. So I'd like to share a quick video on how United Way and our partners are providing food for our neighbors in need inside Carroll County.
Westminster Rescue Mission has been serving the community for over 50 years. And we've been doing our part, growing the food program along with the Maryland Food Bank and now the United Way. We're able to reach more families here in Carroll County. It was a struggle there for a while to be able to find the funding, to be able to come out to communities further away from where our home base is. And now with the different partnerships, it's a great opportunity to get out in the community like we do here in Tawnytown, but reach other parts of the county also.
Transportation is a huge barrier in the Tawnytown area. Many of them don't have a vehicle, or there's only one vehicle in the house. So many families are left at home without any kind of a transportation. I think having multiple resources in one location is helpful to anyone, but especially to our low-income families.
The board here does a myriad of things for Carroll County, everything from grant awarding and grant making for local nonprofits to special projects, which is one of the focuses that I take near and dear to my heart, where we actually have found some opportunities in the community where we can distribute food and household goods to areas in the county which have the greatest need, maybe don't have access to food banks, don't have access to various costly household goods, and we try to fill that need by joining together nonprofit organizations with donations with people that are in need.
It's very helpful to have the resources right here in Tawnytown It's closer to home. With limited amount of time I can be away from the house. It's, 10 minutes to town, drive through, and I'm back home within no time. So it's very convenient to be right here in town.
So we hope you enjoyed that video. Hopefully it was helpful. The 2020 ALICE report, it showed that 29% of Carroll County households were ALICE. And the biggest group, believe it or not, was people aged 65 and older. So our interactive ALICE report is chock full of illuminating data on each county in Central Maryland. And I just urge you to check it out on our website. We'll also certainly make sure that as we move forward, we drop the link in the chat for more information. So from our perspective and from our lens, this work is so vital. It is really incredibly important that we recognize our sponsors. And so on behalf of United Way, I want to thank the sponsors of this important report. You can see on the screen many, many sponsors that have helped us in this regard. And so with that, I'm encouraged by the work that's being done with so many incredible partners. Food distributions throughout the year at sites across Central Maryland are just a part of United Way's work to get healthy food to people who can't afford it, or who live where the closest grocery store may be a very long walk or a bus ride away. So we can't do it alone, though. That's the truth. We can't do it alone. And helping people where they are, providing what they desperately need, it really does depend on all of us working together, right? There's so much power and promise in partnerships. United Way works closely with corporate partners like McCormick, Lyft, and DoorDash, with other nonprofits, with community gardens and corner stores, just to make sure folks have consistent access to healthy, nutritious food. Sometimes we take that for granted, all those on the call today. So the moderator for today's Reality of Inequity session represents one of those partners, Hungry Harvest, a food delivery company that uses farm fresh fruits and vegetables that would otherwise, go to waste. So in addition to their partnership with United Way, McCormick and Company, Holly Poultry on our monthly Dinner on Us food distributions in our South Baltimore neighborhood zone, Hungry Harvest also offers reduced cost produce in SNAP, what we call SNAP markets, donates food to other hunger-solving organizations, and has an emergency box food program to just help get food to those who really need it most. So here to tell you more and to lead today's vibrant, I think, awesome discussion is Evan Lutz, the CEO and co-founder of Hungry Harvest. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you so much, Franklin. I'm beyond excited to be here to talk about this really important topic. We've got only about 50 minutes to cover a lot of content and information. And there is a lot that needs to be covered here in terms of the food system. I want to thank you to United Way of Central Maryland for putting this panel together. Super important to be having this discussion. So for our panel today, we've got three extraordinary people doing some pretty amazing things in their communities around Maryland. We've got Eric Jackson, who is the founder and servant director of the Black Yield Institute. We've got Carmen Del Guecho, who is the president and CEO of the Maryland Food Bank. And we've got Stephanie Haley, who is the executive director of the Westminster Rescue Mission. Now, the four of us could probably sit in a room for about 8 hours and talk about food justice and the food system. And what I'd like to do over the next 50 minutes is narrow that down to the best 50 minutes of that 8-hour discussion. And in the next 50 minutes, I'd like to cover really three essential things. First, I want to talk about the problem. What is the problem of food insecurity and hunger a little bit more in depth? What are the barriers and challenges that people in the greater Baltimore area and Maryland face? How has the face of hunger and food insecurity evolved over the course of the pandemic? Next, I'd like to really dive in depth with all of the fantastic work that the panelists are doing. They're employing much needed solutions that should be highlighted and should be talked about. And finally, I'd like us to cover what remains to be done to drive more positive change. In my humble opinion, that change does not occur without collaboration. The only way to really drive that change is for people to work together. Nonprofits, government, for-profits, the community, everybody needs to get on the same page, have conversations, and talk about what needs to be done to really fight against food insecurity and hunger. We've got a pretty unique opportunity here. We've got 100 people in the room. We've got many more signed up that I'm sure are going to be coming in a little bit later. We've got a lot of people on the call that are interested in solving food insecurity in Baltimore. This is a unique opportunity. And so my ask for the panel members is, how can the audience get involved? How can we inspire this group of people to be the ones to make calls on behalf of their respective organizations, to any of the panelists, any other listeners today? A lot of smart people in this room. It's a pretty unique opportunity for Baltimore to come together to work through food justice. So with that being said, let's go to our panelists. Let's talk a little bit about the Black Yield Institute first. Eric, I'll jump to you first. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your organization, and after a brief introduction, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the biggest barriers that you see that people currently face when getting access to fresh, healthy food?
Sure. Thank you all for the opportunity to share about our work and what we do, and a little bit about our, worldview. I am Eric Jackson. For some on the call, might be endearingly or otherwise called Brother Eric. I serve as the Serving Director of Black Yield Institute, and the way that we describe ourselves, we are a Pan-African power institution, movement building institution. Our aim is to address food apartheid as it exists in our community and as it shows up. And when I say in our community, talking specifically as it plays out in urban and rural Black and brown communities. And then also not only addressing the impacts of food apartheid, we also are interested in building movement, leading and supporting movement toward what we call Black land and food sovereignty. And our work in general is, because we have a movement approach, it's pretty dynamic. I think that it has to be, Evan kind of alluded to this. I think not only collaborations, our work have to also be dynamic, whether that happens within one institution, across institutions and coalitions, because we have dynamic problems, right? These are not just like, oh, people don't have good food. It's a little more nuanced than that. And I think that our solutions have to be nuanced. And so for us, how we're doing that work is through a bit of policy work, some knowledge production that hopes to raise to the surface how these issues show up, especially for people who do not have the privilege or the on the ground knowledge of how food apartheid shows up, how it impacts other people where, we don't live, and also just in general to tell our stories and inspire ourselves. We also, so that leads me to talk about our political education work, which we are organizing cohorts of people who are the organizers and people who are directly impacted by issues, who are being prepared with organizing skills to address the issues. And then we're also standing up these projects like Cherry Hill Food Co-op, which is a cooperatively owned grocery store that's in development right now. Fingers crossed, we'll be opening that grocery store and have it operational in the first quarter of 2024. And then lastly, food production and distribution is a part of our work as well. The production of that food all the way to aggregating and getting that food to our people, including procuring it from other Black and local sources. So that's our work in general. And the question was?
About the barriers that you see people facing about getting access to fresh, healthy food.
Sure. I know, I imagine that other folks will talk about a bunch. So I'm gonna back up and just kind of talk about some of the structural issues, and I'll talk very briefly about those because as you said, Evan, we can talk about this for 8 hours, and I don't have 2 of them to share. However, I would say, I talked about food apartheid, or at least used the language. I'll attempt to explain that and then, yield. So the way that we talk about food apartheid is that it's a social issue that's historic and rooted in race and class that essentially diminishes the self-determination of Black and brown and poor communities to not only access to good food, but it unfortunately kind of it materializes in what we all see and what the ALICE data showed and what any other health profile will show you, diet-related illnesses like hypertension and things of that nature. And largely communities and members of the community really being in a position where other people decide what's available in the community and what means that those are available. And one of the things I really want to have to speak to is just this over-reliance on one particular way to get food, and that is on the grocery store or the supermarket. Human beings throughout the world actually get most of their food through marketplaces. And so if you're talking about a space where people have presumably and have the ability to learn skills of growing food and preparation of food, and even have the ability to establish businesses that retail spaces that provide food for folks, then the question would be why in Black and brown and poor communities this does not exist. And not only that, why is it that the grocery store isn't there? And I think, the short of it might be that the business model doesn't work. And so then the question is, why then are we outsourcing help rather than really developing the capacity of the people to solve our own issues? And so it's a big issue that I said is dynamic, that does include not having access to good food and the presence of environmental racism that impacts people's ability, or what food is available from the soil to the water and the air qualities. It also includes people not really making the decisions for ourselves, what's available in our communities, especially culturally appropriate food, because especially where I live and where I'm speaking from, the best you can get from a retail space is, foods that are not high in nutrients and very high in fat and oil and salt. And then I think the last thing that I'll say is that the imposition of what is food also impacts people's ability to be able to connect with food. For example, I grew up playing with dandelion and playing with acorns, but not really seeing it as food. And I think that that's not a coincidence. Corporations they benefit from us not seeing food around us, and activities and survival skills like foraging are not, a part of, how we think about getting our food. And unfortunately, even growing your own garden up until recently hasn't been something that folks really have talked about as well. So we have these generational gaps. And so unfortunately, what it comes down to is people are passing prematurely and living with disease. And it creates situations where food is not only not available now, but also the passing of traditions and activities around cooking in culturally appropriate ways are hard to come by. And so it's the presence and the absence of some of those oppressive systems, the absence of actual food and knowledge base, and I would say ultimately limited power that impacts food insecurity in the areas where we are and how we see the world. So I'll yield there because, again, we don't have 2 hours.
Yeah, well said, Eric. And to sum up everything that you talked about, it's not only the access to the food, it's about the knowledge of what is food that is super important. And we don't have nearly as big of a discussion as we should have on that in kind of society today. Stephanie, I want to move on to you and learn a little bit more about what your organization does, and ask you the same question. What do people in your community face? What are the biggest challenges and barriers that they face to get access to fresh, healthy food. Do you see some of the same issues around education of what is fresh, healthy food, or is it mainly transportation? And if you could talk to us a little bit about Westminster Rescue Mission, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Evan. And it was good to hear you, Eric. I'm Stephanie Halley, Executive Director of the Westminster Rescue Mission. We're here in Carroll County. The beginning of our time together, you saw that brief video that highlighted a partnership that we have with the food bank and United Way here in Tawnytown. I say here in Tawnytown, I'm sitting in Westminster, and it's not that far down the road. But we're an organization that's been around since the 60s, and we do a few different things, including an addiction healing center, but our food program has been around for a number of years, and it really started as a pantry here on site where we are. We're in a rural community. Our campus, we have about 27 acres. We're on an old farmland. So it's a little bit different setting, but we have a pantry and people come to our pantry. Over time, in addition to having our pantry, we, particularly through our partnership with the food bank and support from the United Way, we have been transforming the work that we do into being an organization that redistributes as well. So we're not just getting food and giving it to people here, but we're getting food and then helping to supply a network of partners throughout our county so that the food can get as close to people as possible. As I mentioned, we're sitting on a farm. So obviously, what do people have to get to come to us? They need transportation, right? They have to get here. And it's not the easiest place to walk to. And if you do walk, carrying all your groceries might be a hard thing to do. So certainly we do see transportation as an issue, and that's part of the reason for kind of our new model with, how can we get food out to, out as far and wide as possible in our community. Transportation, an obvious issue. Physical limitations. So it's not just, do I have a car or do I have something, but can I get out? Do I have health challenges? How do I get food? And so I love some of the partnerships with delivery, right? I love the delivery model because that's important for some folks who really can't get to the food. But I think, and I appreciate very much the conversation around prioritizing healthy and culturally appropriate food and giving folks choice, because I think for a long time, and even though we have this conversation, the problem persists that what is a choice model? And a choice model isn't just, hey, go into a grocery store type setting and choose from what is there. But a choice model really needs to look a lot more like folks listening and having conversations and really engaging the folks that we're serving. I'll say I've had a number of conversations with lots of different really great organizations, really great people who have been doing this work for a long time. And I'm sure you've heard the term preaching to the choir, right? Oftentimes, we are talking and we're asking questions of the people who are coming to our pantry, right? The people who are in our worlds, but we're not going outside of that choir loft, so to speak. We're not going outside of that church to ask not just to ask the question, to survey people, what do you need? What do you want? Yes, that's important, but to truly work together and to have folks be a part of that solution, that will change the way we do business, right? That will change the way it'll change the kinds of food we offer. It'll change the ways that we do it. It will engage folks in the conversations, as Eric talked about with you know, the kinds of food that we can eat and what's available and how do we cook it and all of those types of things. So I think that true engagement beyond the survey, right? Beyond talking to people who are already coming to our doors and figuring out how we do that is a problem that we need to figure out as a community.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said, Stephanie. And I can imagine it's a lot of for-profits, you know, take this approach of like trying to reach out for more customers, and it's a challenge for a lot of for-profits to do. It's even harder in some cases for nonprofits to go out and reach more folks, right? You're talking to the same people that are using your service. How do you reach people that are not using your service yet?
Right.
It's a big challenge.
Right. Absolutely.
I guess, and I know you might be
Go
asking me
ahead.
to answer the same question, but I just want to build a bit on Stephanie's a bit
Please.
about this notion of, you know, one of the challenges we're going to be facing, and we're already starting to face, is that the COVID has created a very efficient model for food distribution, right? Pre-boxed, low-touch interactions. Even though, you know, we as an organization did a lot of work to try to ensure that box was as strong as it could be in terms of the type of product and the variation of product, and they're getting some feedback on that. But that became a very easy distribution model. We kind of have to break that mold so we can get back and engaging with our neighbors around their needs and find ways to create a much more dignified, a much more interactive, much more informative exchange, so that we can make better decisions and bring more resources to bear in these communities. And so that puts a lot of pressure on nonprofits who don't have a lot of volunteers to work from or have limited space, right? And so we're having to break those efficiencies that were gained by that distribution model is one of our challenges. And thankfully, organizations like Stephanie's, you know, are thinking about it the same way, but there are other organizations who are just have certain limitations and aren't able to do it. So I just want to hit on that, as I think that's one of the things that we're trying to work towards, to kind of get back to this notion of a much more dignified experience. And to your point of choice, you know, it's one thing to ask people who you're already serving, but how do we begin to reach, as you say, other people that we're maybe not reaching today? And that's where local partners that we work with, 350 across our state, are critical to that, because those are the folks who know those communities best and how to reach people that otherwise they may not be reaching. You know, for us, just to dovetail into quickly on our focus. I mean, we've been distributing food to communities across the state for 43 years. Our focus primarily right now is twofold. One is to do that in a way that enhances the nutritional content of the food we're distributing more significantly than maybe historically, and to also find creative ways to reach more people. This is using very different programmatic responses. In addition to that, we really start to focus our attention on trying to address root causes of hunger in a bigger way. We think our ability to really solve this thing for the long term, we need to be thinking more broadly about the services that we are able to provide to neighbors in need, with working with our partner network, right? So going back to challenges, as a statewide organization, we unfortunately, every community has a different set of challenges in terms of how it's addressing the need in their communities. It could be a transportation in more rural markets. It could be just your access in other markets. And so we are trying to customize our response to understand the dynamics in that community in a deeper way, and making sure that we should be agnostic to the programmatic response. We just want to put the right response out that we think is best, can be the most effective one in that community. And then for us too, you know, the cover photo, if you will, of this webinar is telling. And going back to some of the things that Eric was talking about, that is the source oftentimes for far too many communities, that corner store, which has no nutritional, you know, oftentimes does not have any nutritional content, whose cost of product is really oftentimes off the charts. And so, you know, our ability to try to find ways to reach people in those communities, absent a commercial response, to your point, Eric, being the market necessarily not providing it, what other ways can we do that? And that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I love that comprehensive solutions-based approach, Carmen. And I think I'll ask that to the rest of the panel. So let's move to the solution side of this. We've talked about dignified choice, right? And Stephanie mentioned, Eric, you talked about community-owned grocery stores, which I think is super important. What are some other solutions that either your organization is employing today, or you were thinking about starting, or that you've heard other organizations in other cities that are doing, that are pretty innovative to help fight food insecurity and hunger?
So I can jump in. I think one of the areas that we're moving into, and we've been doing this to some extent, but as I can't remember if it was Carmen or Eric mentioned, just kind of I think it was Carmen, during COVID, choice kind of went a little bit down the tubes, right? We weren't having that high contact and we weren't having those conversations. But as we come out of that, I think we have an opportunity to look at food as a piece of a larger problem, right? So we have to go beyond how do we make sure that everybody has, good access to healthy food, and making choices about those types of foods, but also looking at a larger issue, so that we're not just a food delivery system, but that we are looking at root problems, root causes, addressing really how did we get here. And that involves a lot in terms of the structure, of our society, which I think Eric was touching on, but also the system of services that we have. So if somebody comes to us at the mission, and they've got a host of problems, usually food isn't the only one, right? There are many problems that they're facing. And in a rural, in somewhere that's rural like ourselves, or even in the city, you can bounce around a whole lot to a lot of different services. And that is really difficult to navigate, really difficult to navigate. And so how do we make sure that we are a part of a larger solution, right? And that we're connecting and making sure people have access to those other services. That doesn't mean we as the food distributor or the pantry have to do all those services, but we do have to do a better job of working with our partners in the community so that people aren't, if somebody has a problem getting to the pantry, they're going to have problems getting to the case manager and getting to the child care and getting to the legal services, all of that, right? So how do we help navigate and make sure that those other services are accessible as well? That's a part of the solution that we need to focus on more.
Yeah, for us, if I could just build on that a little bit, for us, that's really having us think differently about what a partner looks like going forward, right? That's not to say that, we have some partners who are truly who only food distribution, right? That's their primary focus. That's really their primary. And so those were important to have those partners as well. But as we go forward, thinking about organizations who are thinking more broadly about the impact that they can have in their community and how they can begin to we can use that platform as a way to introduce other services. And going back to your collaboration piece, I'm not going to be an expert in transportation. We're not going to be an expert in healthcare, but we can engage these providers for access to neighbors in a much more proactive versus reactive referral way, right? I mean, referrals are great. I'm glad we at least get something going, but that still puts a big burden on the neighbor to navigate the system. And so to the extent that we can bring that closer to these communities in a way that really allows folks to progress more quickly down that path. But it's done through a position of, there's a certain amount of trust and credibility that Stephanie's organization has in their community. So I'm comfortable coming to you, sharing my story, and making myself available for these other services. And I think our partner networks start to look a little differently, both in terms of our food providers, but also other organizations we work with to bring their services into our 330 organization network. And I think that really, that's where the collaboration piece can really be powerful for us. Food is a driver that brings people into these organizations, but the issue behind it is varied. And so our ability to kind of begin to tackle that more broadly is I think, critical to our success.
Yeah. So what I would insert into the conversation, certainly, there's need for, and I mentioned before, self-determination. And I think that choice is important. And I think stretching choice a little further is around self-determination. How do we bolster not only people's skills, but also the local economies, right? The community-based economies, the regional economies, for people to be able to produce as much as they can, not only production of food, but also production of solutions, right? I think that a lot of our, forgive my politics, but here we go. A lot of our leaders, I think our policies and practices inherently show that outsourcing is the way that we think about solution posing, not insourcing, right? We say that the people have the solutions. However, the question is, do people have powerful enough institutions that have the resources necessary to employ those solutions is the other piece. And so I think there's some other innovative things that I want to lift up for policymakers and others to really think about, leaders and organization leaders, elected officials, and so forth. In my prepared stuff, I have 3 of them. One, certainly people-centered policies that consider reparations frameworks, right? Land reparations, as well as reparations that connect to financial resources. And the reason I say that, you can't employ self-determination without making sure that communities and the organizations, whether they be civic institutions, nonprofits, community-based organizations, faith institutions, or otherwise, that have the resources necessary to actually do the things we say we want to do. Policy, from legislation to technical assistance and dollars, can help to build that. We've been working with other organizations to really move this concept of community control of land here in the city, not just for the sake of agricultural purposes, but also for the sake of having green spaces and developing retail spaces that are owned and operated by community organizations or otherwise. And which brings me to my second point of the need for further exploring what I like to call movement enterprises, right? It's so social enterprises that are connected to larger movements that meet needs, like cooperatives, like other retail businesses, other farm businesses, and other incubators and things like that. These types of businesses not only provide needs of the people, however, I think can advance some of the ideas that we've been talking about in this conversation of people feeling even more empowered to have choice, and not just giving people choice, but also people feel like they can demand, you know what, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't get this grant money, so this is what I need you to carry, right? People power. And then I think the last thing for me, I talked earlier about political education. I think that that's of critical importance, and not just in terms of how food systems operate, but also how they move, because an informed people are people who can move the needle in terms of policies, in terms of how programs are designed, from our local medical centers to our local nonprofits, however, those who want to be of good service. That's one thing, and I think that that's important. However, I think in true partnership with people who have a developed analysis, who can say, you know what, here's how you can help me. So I'm bringing in both, right? We want to be able to bolster what we can do and build our own institutions and solutions. And for those who are here to support, how can we put you in the best position to support us while you also not encroaching on our goals as a community? I think that that's of importance. And I know this gets bigger to structural things. I think that that's important because, shifting how we get food to people will be informed by the policies in which we build them on. So I think that's critical.
Eric, something that you've mentioned a couple of times in this conversation that is not nearly talked about enough is self-determination, and communities fixing themselves, right? And communities owning the solutions to having their own agricultural space or their own grocery store, their own way to get food. That is something that, I don't know how to make this story any shorter, but 100 years ago, before we had this centralized grocery store model, we had micro grocery stores, right? We had local farmers markets that were on street corners that were owned by people in the community that they would distribute to people in the community, right? And it was profitable. When the mass adoption of refrigerated trucking happens, it caused a lot of good things to happen. It caused the prices of food to drop. And, if you're in Maine in the winter, you can eat an orange in the winter time, right? Which you wouldn't be able to do before. However, that created a centralized system, which caused a lot of waste and caused a lot of food insecurity. And so now what we have today is we've got these massive 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 square foot grocery stores that need to have a certain foot traffic in order to become profitable. What is a more efficient solution is a smaller footprint grocery store owned by people in the community that doesn't need the amount of foot traffic in order to become profitable, right? That can insert produce into communities and self-determination, like we've been talking about this whole time. So Stephanie or Carmen or Eric, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that at all, but I think it's really important for us to talk about why some of these solutions need to be community driven and need partnerships and funding in order to get some of those solutions done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think those community, that's an excellent point. I mean, we're trying to integrate more neighbor voice into our decision-making process and to understand, what are the respective challenges in the community, what opportunities that might exist, what assets we could potentially help leverage. So I think all that's critically important. One of the challenges that we face, Evan, and this may be a little question for Eric too, is, we're trying to expand our sources, right? And we're trying to find more local sources, especially for fresh produce. And we're focused on smaller community-based farms to help drive some of that. What we do find though is, and I guess this is maybe a little bit of a question for you too, Eric, is the ultimate purpose of that local community-based, let's focus on ag for a second, is it primarily to serve the local community, or is it more of a for-profit enterprise that's hopefully that might be serving a broader community? And for us, our ability to source product from some of those sources is very limited in terms of the amount of product they have for us to be able to do that in a very scalable way. And so to your point now, I'm now going right back to the model you just talked about in terms of scale and efficiency, but that's one of the challenges we're facing in trying to reach out to smaller sources. How much food can we possibly access and how quickly can we get that into the community? And sometimes, sometimes that potential local farm may be primarily focused on local community, and that would be the ideal scenario. But I don't know, we're having a hard time necessarily making more and more inroads in that so that we can provide, a revenue stream, frankly, for some of these farmers to continue to sustain their business, to invest in local communities, to hire more people, to acquire more land and do the kind of things that they can help them to thrive in this environment, because we want to help in that with regard just to purchasing of food. We're going to buy from somebody. We just soon buy from somebody in a local community. But sometimes I find that there's just not enough there to support the local community as well as to support a broader community that we might be trying to serve. I don't know if there's a solution to that, but that's kind of one of the challenges we face.
I think it's both, and to answer that question, I think, and I also want to clarify that when I talk about self-determination, because the easy thing is to hear that as like, well, they got it, we ain't got nothing to do with it. And for the sake of trying to be careful for the virgin ear, I would say that specifically what we're talking about in terms of like the work that we do, Black people haven't gotten to this blank by ourselves, so we're not going to get out of it by ourselves. And so I'm very clear about that. So it's to say, hey, where there's a need for financial resources, technical assistance, and otherwise, thank you, bye-bye, go ahead and go. And other times there's opportunity for partnership. I know that even with a push for sovereignty, right? A greater control of our food environments and our food systems. That's not to say that we're going to grow all the food that we have locally. That is pie in the sky rhetoric that I don't want people to misinterpret me saying that. Mm. What I am saying though, to answer part of your question, Carmen, is I think that the practice of self-determination begets more self-determination. If you can get people making the decisions about what's available in the corner store, I think that it's not a stretch philosophically to jump to, at some point with a further intervention, to have people deciding now, you know what? I think that here's a gap in our local economy. Here's how we're going to fill that through cooperative economics and so forth. And to the question of scalability, I think you're right. One of the very pragmatic ways that we've talked about this is actually with the conversation, and never materialized just because I think pandemic and other competing priorities. But we had a conversation with Maryland Food Bank about securing food from Black farmers to then distribute out to the city. So it's not that it was gonna put a huge dent into what the sourcing. However, I think it was more about supporting the local farmers. And I think that there's a merit to that, and beyond merit, there's a necessity for that to bolster these enterprises, whether they be farm enterprises or food enterprises, to go into, and not in any token way. I'm talking about a very real way. Hey, contract buying and selling, right? We want to buy this amount, and it may not happen in a small community-based farm. However, it might happen in a coalition. Like Alliance of Baltimore.
Right.
It might happen through a network. And I think those types of opportunities can jumpstart the type of connection. And I am going to, especially because this is recorded, regret myself saying this later. However, I have to say it, especially because of the audience. The role of governments, and especially white philanthropic and other institutions, to jumpstart some of these types of like scalable operations, even if they're collective and cooperative, is, I think, not talked about enough and not enumerated enough. I think that if you have an organization that says, hey, we want to source from you all to get to the people 70% of what you grow, that would jumpstart some operations and activities that we've been working through that I've found is a little different when me, I would say a leader in this space say, hey, y'all, we should organize ourselves and figure out how to feed our people. That sounds a little different than when you might come with like, I got 50,000, we want to distribute that 50,000 amongst 5 organizations for you to grow X amount of food for this year. It jumpstarts something that I think could be powerful. The reason I'm kicking myself for it is because that acknowledges that white dollars can move Black people in a way. However, if I don't say it, it won't be said. And so I think that that's important. So sometimes it's cool to get out the way, and other times it might be cool to throw around your white privilege a little bit. I'll take your white privilege if it comes in the matter of money, and that's going to feed our people, and that's going to help us grow the work that we're doing, then we can do that. But that conversation to say, hey, we want to support you, let's figure this out, and being patient in that, and also not trying to take that over, is a very pragmatic way that I think we can deal with, again, building not only coalitions and networks of communities that are looking to be self-determined. Being self-determined ain't the same thing as saying we're going to do it all by ourselves. And so I think that there's a way to support that. And I'm going to be quiet because I can talk about this ad nauseum.
No, I appreciate that perspective, and I think we got something here that we can build on. I think as we get the next growing season, I think this is something for us because we're prepared to do that, and frankly, at the end of the day, we understand that there's even a cost structure that could potentially be more expensive in an effort to make sure that we're providing a fair return for the folks involved. And so we're willing to accept that, if you will, and recognize that this is not about an efficiency play. This has greater payoffs down the road in terms of all the value of that. And so the fact that we're going to pay an extra 5 cents a pound or 10 cents a pound or 20% a pound, really in the grand scheme of things is our investment, if you will, if that's the right way to do that, to try to help make sure this happens. And so thank you for saying that. And I think this is an opportunity for us to re-engage in that conversation.
I appreciate that. And the last thing I'll say, I promise, I'm sorry, Stephanie.
That's right.
To that point, I think that that's the point that I was making at the end. Our frameworks have to be different, meaning our expectations have to be different. The process for determining the pricing has to be different. And we have to build that trust on the front end. It's not enough to just put money there, because we won't do it the same way that the farmer who has 100 acres and who's been doing this for 20 years or third generation can do. And I think it requires a little bit of flexibility and, more importantly, new frameworks for how we do business together.
Fair. Yep. Great point. Thank you.
Right. And I was just going to say that I love all of those points, and I might be kicking myself, but as I look at how kicking myself later, but as I look at that model, Carmen, I'm talking to you, of where to invest dollars, right? Maybe they don't all come to pantry partners, but to that source of food and looking at the communities that we're investing in. And so I think that's incredible. And I think as we are talking, this kind of gets me to that collective impact idea, right? So I think part of what we struggle with is that we're all too often kind of going down our own path and not working together. And yes, the pantries are talking to each other, right? And yes, that, different communities are talking to each other. But what we're talking about here is it's the pantries, it's the philanthropists, it's the farmers, it's the people who are buying, it's the right. And so it's all of these people who should be at the table. And too often, I think it's us talking to each other, right?
Right.
Which is good. I love talking to you guys. But I need to be talking to my farmer down the street. I do.
Right.
And they're a part of the solution, and they've got ideas about that and that can benefit them and their community. And so how we go about doing that and who is at the table is incredibly important and changes the conversation, right? I mean, just look at what just happened right here, right? Change the conversation from, to, hey, maybe we need to be investing in farmers. That's a different conversation.
Yeah. And if I could just comment on that really quickly and then pose a question to everybody as we wrap up. We've got about 9 minutes left or so. Eric, I am so glad you said what you said, because that was exactly the kind of content that I'm hoping came out of this conversation, because we want to dive deep into the details and like, enough is enough. Like we need to try and solve food insecurity and we need to get on the phone and collaborate. The second thing I want to say is, and this is sort of the question I want to ask everybody is, what can the audience members do to help get involved? So one of the action items that I'm taking away and that all four of us are taking away really is we need to collaborate more. We need to get on the phone. We need to talk about ways we can solve some of these issues, because it's not going to be just government or nonprofits or food banks or pantries that solve it by themselves. It's going to be a collaboration, a cooperation of organizations. And so there are people on this call today that I know are part of the government, or know are part of philanthropies or donors or part of food organizations that I would love to kind of understand how can they reach out to you guys? What can they do to really drive positive change? So maybe Carmen, if you want to take away that question, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some chats coming through about, I'm going to take this back to my team, right? First thing we do is kind of elevating the conversation to make more people aware of some of the challenges we're facing, whether it's in your organization or within people's individual network. And then from there, to extend to take action. I mean, one of the things that I find is that we don't talk enough. We often talk when we have a specific question or issue we're trying to address and say, hey, maybe we should talk to Stephanie, maybe we should talk to Evan, or maybe we should talk to Eric about that, right? As opposed to saying, let's just talk. Like we had a conversation with Franklin and his team about 2 months ago, and I learned about 3 initiatives that they're doing. I had no idea, right? So now we're starting to think, okay, are there ways for us to be interacting with those initiatives that we can add some value to that as a participant that maybe Franklin's team hasn't thought about or we haven't thought about? And so now you begin to realize that there are activities, because I think there's good activity going on in a lot of these communities, but it's generally, it's pretty narrow in its focus, or it's not as broad in terms of who's actually involved. And so to the extent that we understand and know, and people are sharing that, I think that's an opportunity for us to find ways in which we can add some value in kind of non-traditional creative ways. I mean, for instance, we're partnering with 3 workforce development programs right now, right, that are focused on green jobs, healthcare, and technology. We focus on those because those are high-paying career jobs. And what's the role now in food bank? We're not going to be experts in workforce development, but we can provide a food solution to those participants. Hopefully, helps attract more participants. Maybe helps the retention rates, and we also provide a stipend. So it's we've got to find creative solutions as a way to enhance some of the work that's already been done there by bringing more well-rounded approach. So I think this is a great start to this, to increase awareness, start a dialogue, and force people to start asking more questions, or just, if nothing else, informing each other the type of things we are doing in communities that people can potentially help with.
And Stephanie, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up with Eric, please. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Sure. I think in addition to kind of, taking this conversation back to your team, and I think very simply asking the question, who am I not talking to that I should be talking to, right? Who should I be having conversations with? I think it's a simple question, but there's a lot there if we're really asking it and taking time to ask that question. And the other thing that I would just be remiss if I didn't mention is, how are we measuring our success? How am I measuring my success as an organization? How are we as a community measuring our success? And we've got to go beyond pounds of food that we're distributing. We've got to go beyond that and talk about people exiting a system, right? People being lifted and lifting themselves, and the community lifting one another up. How do we measure that? What does that look like? And we have to dig into that to be able to continue to move us down the field.
So I'm going to say only a couple of things, I promise this time. So the first thing I will say is I am an educator, so that one of the things, not in any traditional sense. I think further, as we talked about, and Carmen mentioned it, and Stephanie mentioned it, further dialogue, discussion, and I would say broadly and generally saying political education in a very pragmatic way. It could be setting up book clubs or what have you. I would remiss if I didn't say this. It can have BYI coming in to start that dialogue, right? I think how we measure success, I think, is important, and I would agree with that. I would also add assessing how we, what I like to call is our language action assessment, right? What am I saying versus what I'm doing? The conversation of access without critical analysis about power is, we're probably going to replicate the same stuff. And so to Stephanie's point about a new system, you can't move to a new system without new thinking, without new consciousness. For those who have proclivities and leanings toward Christianity, you'll remember Jesus talking about, maybe I shouldn't get religious, however, we're here now. Jesus talking about new wine and old wineskin. It doesn't work, right? So I think this idea of being able to shift how we think, we can come into collaborative spaces still thinking like individuals.
Right.
We can still and probably still will bring in our white supremacy, we'll bring in our heteropatriarchy, we'll bring in our ableism, we'll bring in all of those things. And so getting clear about that, I think, and the best way to do that as an organization is starting with those assessments, getting training and creating the type of internal policies that would allow you to think differently. It's not just what we do, because I think we can do a good work with great intentions and do it in ways that still perpetuate the things that we say we want to do something different. So those assessments are important, and really creating new policies and practices for not only how we touch people, but where we do that, with whom we partner with, and just really adding to Stephanie's point that I think we have to shift our entire barometer.
We've talked about a lot of pretty important things here today. We've talked about self-determination, we've talked about dignity of choice, we've talked about collaborating, getting more in the room, bringing new thought. All of those are going to be really essential if we want to make a solid fight against food insecurity and hunger. I just want to wrap up and say a big thank you to Carmen, Stephanie, and Eric. You guys did a fantastic job on this panel, and my hope is that this panel and this conversation with the 100 people that participated, this is not the only conversation. This is the start. This is the start of conversation. People leave this conversation and go have new ones, and start collaborating more. Reach out to myself, reach out to Carmen, Stephanie, Eric, if you guys want to talk really about what is going to be the future of the food system in Baltimore and in Maryland. It doesn't get done without collaborating, doesn't get done without talking. So if there's one thing you take away from this conversation, that's it. This needs to be the start. Thank you also to United Way for putting together this panel. I think it's an awesome series that you guys are doing. Such an important topic, and you did a great job at bringing together 3 amazing panelists. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. You can find all of our information right here on the screen. Please reach out if you'd like to collaborate in any opportunities. And again, big thank you to the panelists and the audience for joining today.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, panelists. Phenomenal. Wonderful, wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.